the next thing we kind of want to talk about is what are some of the myths that we've seen in whistleblower calls. For example, Greg, I mean, is it better to have less calls or more calls?
Well, Mark, in preparation for our discussion today, you and I think you had forwarded me a 2020 Harvard study entitled "Throw Out Your Assumptions About Whistleblowing," and when we reviewed that document, a couple of things jumped out to me. Number one, more issues reported is a good thing, and that's for several reasons. The study found that companies have, with more complaints from whistleblowers, have actually fewer lawsuits. They have smaller bills related to legal settlements, and they have fewer fines levied against them. So companies with more internal reports from whistleblowers have more positive attributes. They are more profitable. They have better governance practices, and I think this study really highlighted those trends. So I'd rather be in that bucket than one where you're paying $3 billion worth of fines and criminal studies, as we talked about earlier. I think
And
the
we've
report.
seen that. Oh, sorry. And we've seen that in practice too, because a lot of compliance officers and HR directors are very ecstatic and happy when they get a low call volume for that year, but that's really not the case. It's not saying, they're trying to, defend their position by saying, well, we haven't had that many calls. That means, we have a really good fraud prevention program, and we're just not committing fraud. And that's typically not true. You'd rather have more calls and more false positives, more sour grapes calls than you would to have, not enough calls and people are not coming forward and you're missing a lot of opportunities, like you said in the prior slides.
No, absolutely. Mark, just to amplify that point, in our conversations, at least in my time with Kreller, and when you and I have been on investigations, and when we talk to chief compliance officers, I think they've echoed that a couple of times. Where, hey, we have either no or low call volume, or the details that we're getting are very scant. But I would argue that those initial details, the initial call that comes in, while the details may be scant, that's an opportunity. That's a starting point. So the employee may not be divulging everything they can in these initial complaints. They just want to start a conversation. They're looking for someone to come talk to them, someone to pay attention, and then that conversation may potentially reveal more information. One example, Mark, that I can give is a client that you and I worked with recently, and this client was utilizing a third party as a distributor. The third party had an established hotline. They, however, given the size of the third party, where geographically they were doing their business, and the sensitive products that they were dealing with, they actually, our observation was that their hotline call volume was actually very low. And we asked
Right.
why that was so. And I think we pointed out, rightly so, and I think you'll talk about this later, is training for high risk employees, I think is very critical. And, do these high risk employees know what to look for? Do they know how to report it? What level does the organization have in supporting whistleblowers to come forward? Mark, you may have another example. I think of a recent case where you had allegations of purchasing kickback scheme. I don't know if that can shed some light on this discussion too.
Yeah, that was an interesting case because, it was in Latin America. The call did not come through the hotline. It came through a different avenue. And, when we did a fraud risk assessment of the company, it looked like for the size, they were about $900 million in revenue, and they were all over the world in a lot of countries with a high reputation for corruption. And yet they had a very low call volume, and they seemed to be happy about that. And that's, certainly not the case. Obviously the initial whistleblower call that we received, it didn't come through the hotline. It just came through different avenues, and that's fine too. But certainly when you talk to the person, the whistleblower, they were too afraid to call the hotline, and so they need to make sure they communicate that they're not going to retaliate against employees for coming through the hotline. The other myth
Uh,
I think that we've seen that the study showed is also the volume or content of a whistleblower call being higher or lower might indicate, you know, a less credible call. What do you think about that, Greg?
well, yeah, obviously and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail going forward, but the credibility and the veracity of the caller should be assessed early on in the investigative process. But to your point, the call may be anonymous. The call may have scant details, but again, it could be a missed opportunity if you just kind of brush it off and say like, oh, this doesn't have any merit, but without doing your due diligence to look into it further, there could be a missed opportunity there to save your company money and time and penalties. So I would say that initial assessment phase, when the call comes in, looking at whatever details they provide, as scant as they might be, is a starting point towards a conversation that could lead to a broader investigation.
And we had a case where a whistleblower laid out in very scant details about an issue involving international trade. And we ended up contacting that person, even though they remained anonymous. And the more we probably met with them 5 times, and each time they gave us more and more detail. So it was almost like
Mm.
we had to develop a rapport with them so that they would trust us before they started giving more information to us. And so the person, could have quite honestly gone to the SEC, and she just decided she just wanted to help. And she was very informative, but initially her initial letter seemed pretty scant. I was a little skeptical just reading the letter until I talked to her.
Well, and Mark, I think given your 20 plus years of investigative experience in corporate investigations, I think lends to that very well. Like you said, and sometimes an external resource can be a good thing in these inquiries, because the whistleblower may not be comfortable for whatever reason. Like you said, maybe the hotline is already set up, and maybe they do even have a culture where the leadership of the company is incentivizing and wanting whistleblowers to come forward if there's any allegations. But with your investigative experience, that where you're actually taking an outsider's view and you're taking the time to look at the allegation and starting a conversation, I think can only enhance that your ability to look at those complaints.